Welcome to Worker Skills and Pay Equity, how compensation and conversations are changing. My name is Matt Gotchi and I'm head of marketing and partnerships at Trusaic, and I'll be facilitating today's conversation. I'm lucky enough to be joined today by Joanna Kim Brunetti, Chief Legal Officer and Executive Vice President of Regulatory Affairs from Trusaic, and Mark Hansen, Vice President of Strategy from Lightcast, formerly MZ Burning Glass. Joanna is a former partner with Aiken Gump Strauss Howard and Feld, has over 20 years of experience advising clients on a wide range of employment, tax, intellectual property, and other related business issues, and she has considerable expertise in pay equity and DEI. Mark leads the strategic initiatives of people analytics and skills, products, and partnerships related to Lightcast open skills and open titles, and both conducts and presents skills research. Prior to Lightcast, Mark was Director of Talent Analytics at United Health Group, where he led the people analytics teams focused on reporting for talent intelligence, talent acquisition, human capital, HR systems, D&I, and learning and development. Mark has 5 years of management consulting experience, 3 years focused on strategic planning and business analysis, and 2 years focused on talent development and leadership training. Joanna and Mark, thank you both for talking with me today. I'm excited for today's conversation. So let's get right to it. Times are really changing. We now have 22 plus states with salary history bands. Lots of states will soon require salary ranges to be posted on every job listing, both internally and externally. And we saw recently where Microsoft said that they will include salary ranges on every job posting by the end of 2023. It's now 2 years since California first required pay data to be reported to the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. And you also have legislation like SB 1162, which is scheduled for a vote in August in California, which proposes making median pay data public. So Mark and Joanna, compensation used to be private. Compensation in general is now becoming more and more transparent every single day. Joanna, let's start with you. What's driving this? What will things look like 5 years from now? And what are the implications to employers?
Let me talk about sort of the factors that drive the trend, and I sort of put them in three buckets. There's sort of public investor pressure, the labor market, and then sort of the regulatory legal pressure. So from a public investor standpoint, movements like Me Too, Time's Up, Black Lives Matter, and even the just, uneven impact of COVID has really made pay inequity and DEI really more important to the public, really more of a key issue. And this is going to be increasing over time because younger generations, i.e. the workforce is getting younger and younger every year, certainly younger relative to me, and they've increasingly placed DEI as an important consideration in with respect to the employer they ultimately choose to go with. And, with this, additionally from a public standpoint, really you've got investors. Investors are currently putting pressure towards this sort of corporate social responsibility, environmental social governance, where the S of ESG is pertaining to social, and this is sort of DEI sort of fits in there. There's this current trend to increase reporting in that vein. And, and there's also right now, a lot of movement in towards of standardizing that type of reporting regarding an organization's diversity and pay equity. So this is sort of the public aspect of what's driving it. And, and relatedly, you've got the labor market. There is currently still a very tight labor market and more choices for workers. So, you guys have probably all been hearing about the Great Resignation. So many workers are changing jobs, and, sort of job loyalty isn't where it used to be. And this is particularly so really post-COVID. The COVID really brought in this sort of remote workforce, hybrid kind of, sort of norm for workers. And, remote workers are less sticky than sort of in-person workers. And so, and that's particularly so among the professional workforce that can work remotely. And so, you've got this younger sort of group coming in every year, and they're more, DEI is more important to them. And, and they tend to be more willing to look for a new job, and DEI is more important. So, that labor market, public investor, that those two factors are pushing this trend. And then separately, which, is sort of its own can of worms, is sort of the regulatory legal environment. As Matt had alluded to, he had created this map of sort of where the pay equity heat map is sort of low, medium, and high. There's a number of areas where this trend is pushing towards transparency. As Matt had talked about, this salary history bans in 22 states, this pay transparency among a bunch of states with regard to identifying the salary range disclosure. And I will tell you, because these salary range disclosures are becoming increasingly more important, this is where external market data is going to be really important to you as an employer considering what to do. So, I'm kind of talking about the trend. I'm going to get to where we are in 5 years in a moment. So you also have pay data reporting. That's, as Matt talked about, SB 973 and the sort of pending SB 1162. What they're doing is, at least California, not to be outdone by, Illinois, California is putting, significant pressure on employers to disclose their pay data. And indeed, the pending SB 1162 is talking about taking that data and putting it out there to the public for the public to see. Illinois is taking a slightly different approach to sort of pay equity auditing and compliance certification. Illinois is actually not only asking you to report your pay data, but it's asking you to certify compliance with pay equity. Hello, I certify as an officer of the corporation, I am in compliance with all pay equity laws. That's a pretty good standard. And so that's going to put a lot of pressure on Illinois sort of nexus employers to comply. Separately, there's, increasingly the states are putting broader coverage in pay discrimination lawsuits. So, basically instead of, Joe and Susie are not being paid the same because their job titles are different. That's not going to fly. There's going to be a broader category of what's considered comparable or substantially similar, et cetera. And so it's going to create a bigger umbrella for people in different jobs to be categorized as comparable to establish pay discrimination. So all of these kind of legal regulatory requirements, and there's increasingly more of them. What they're doing is they're pushing towards pay transparency. So, kind of in summary of all this, what are we going to see in 5 years? We're going to see mandatory pay data reporting, maybe not throughout all of the states, but in a significant majority of the population states that you're going to see that. Typical sort of blue states, you're going to see that pay data reporting requirement in 5 years. You're going to see salary range disclosures required from a legal standpoint. And in truth, also because the public and investor pressure are pushing that, they're pushing the legislator to push for this kind of, transparency. So 5 years, you're going to see salary range disclosures required, in most populous states. You're going to see pay data reporting. You're probably going to see a lot more pay discrimination lawsuits too, quite frankly. Let me also talk about what internationally, so this isn't happening in a vacuum. If you look over across the pond, you will see pay data reporting, pay transparency, pay data shaming. You see that in the UK, France, Italy, Switzerland, Germany, and that, or in Iceland, which actually requires pay equity compliance and certification every several years for employers with 25 or more employees. So internationally, you see this as well, and the US is paying attention, and there's a little bit of monkey see, monkey do on either side. Legislators are always looking at what other legislators are doing. What would, there is a huge pay equity movement internationally, particularly in the gender aspect. But race is not ignored. UK has now race-related pay equity regulations. So that's what's going on internationally. And not surprisingly, that's been happening, frankly, over the last 5 years, with an increase in uptick over the last few years, a little bit of slowdown with COVID, but it's been increasingly so internationally. And analogously, among the states, these pay data reporting, salary history bans, salary transparency, That has also been happening among the states roughly about the same time frame as well. So they're looking at each other. It's not a coincidence. One area I didn't mention that I also want to mention on a regulatory legal framework sense is a pay equity auditing. There are a number of states that are recognizing the importance of pay equity auditing, and they're giving safe harbors. And so you are going to see, you see states like Massachusetts that gives you a complete affirmative defense to state law, pay discrimination laws, if you conduct a pay equity audit and you make reasonable progress. There's sort of lighter versions of that in Oregon and Colorado. There's some new ones in Rhode Island. I think it came out last year. So there's more, all of these factors from a public standpoint, from a labor market standpoint, from a regulatory framework, all of those are pushing towards more pay data reporting, pay transparency, just basically pay disclosures. And so 5 years from now, I don't know that we'll see total uniformity amongst the states, but you will see a significant percentage of the states requiring all of those items.
Oh, great. Thanks, Joanna. That's a great overview.
Yeah, if I may add, just sort of what are these implications to the employer? You've got to get ahead of pay equity, regularly conduct a pay equity audit, address pay disparities, communicate your commitment to DEI progress, actually manage, work on managing your reputation before it manages you. Ensure your salary ranges and hiring don't, just sort of further exacerbate pay inequities. Respond to labor market pressures using data that you are actually taking a look at and running analytics, and enforce your compensation policies and procedures that sort of come out of your pay equity audit. So, gone are the days that once a year, maybe sporadically, you run a pay equity audit, or, oh, we got sued, let's run a pay equity audit. That is not a good time to be running it. You want to be ahead of it. You want to be proactive.
Oh, great. Thanks, Joanna. Yeah, pay equity is getting hotter every day, and employers really do need to take action to get ahead of it. So Mark, let's shift over to you now. Joanna talked about what's driving the need for increased pay transparency and the implications for employers. Mark, in a world where everyone understands how much a job will pay, and where external candidates and internal candidates are well aware of what compensation is for a particular job title, how should employers think differently about compensation, in your opinion?
Yeah, it's going to change a lot of things, and it's going to continue to empower, candidates as they negotiate salary. As we know, with the great, resignation, also dubbed kind of the great reshuffle, because people are just, switching jobs so rapidly, they are going to be way more empowered to know what salary they can negotiate, how far they can push, because there's going to be so many data points out there, especially these multinational and large corporations that operate in all of these states. They're going to have to scramble, and with the few states that do require these regulations, they're going to have to start doing it for all the spots, because they are publicly posting these jobs. And so that pay data will get out very quickly, and it'll change the way the negotiations happen. So as companies are looking at, how do we stay ahead of this? How do we get ready for all of these changes? A huge focus around, how are we looking at our job architecture? How are we defining these roles? Because in a world where you could get audited and you're having to compare certain roles together, you're going to have to be very, very granular with, what is the job? What is the job titles you're using? What are the skills that you're using on these jobs? Are they actually comparable? And with uniqueness in every company, coming up with their own job titles, we're going to see more push for normalization of job titles. We're going to see having to, get to some sort of kind of industry standard or, regulatory standard that can be used for auditing. And we see one of the, keys to this is a skills-based approach, because that's where you can get at kind of that granular atom level of what makes up a job, and how do we start to look at are jobs actually similar? And as we can see pay discrepancies from two different jobs, are they doing the same work or are they doing different work? And one way that we can get down to that granularity is through a skills lens. And so companies are going to be, scrambling, and they should be planning ahead for this. As Joanna mentioned, you got to stay ahead of all of this. You got to be proactive in how you're looking at your roles and your job architecture. Are we doing these proactive audits on ourselves so that we can make sure that we're going to be in compliance when all of these laws do hit? And then are we able to ensure that we, have the proper equity across our roles and across the different groups that make up our talent within our world? One of the things that I think is going to be changing in the next couple of years is obviously a shift towards skills is going to be a huge benefit for companies. It's going to help define their roles better. It's going to help bring that transparency of what is actually required to do the work and where do we go find that. When the labor market's tight, you are relying on lots of different factors to be able to pull those folks in, and individual skills will become more important where there is expertise, where we can seek that out. And job titles, since they are so disparate in their meaning, and companies using different ones, it's actually hard to search for good talent using a job title. And as we look at the compensation side, as we've talked about different companies, I think some of the core base salaries will be, very well structured. I think where the differentiation is going to come in is how companies are going to put in the bonus incentives and different, complicated total rewards packages for the employees. And that's really what's going to set aside, being able to stay compliant, but also how do we retain employees in this tight market? You're going to have some differentiated reward system. And just in general, as you think about the war for competing talent, as you think about, companies that might not be able to afford the same salaries as some of the bigger companies, as there's this race to the top, as the supply is short, so pay is rising rapidly, and we're seeing that within all of our job posting data every day, that that's the first lever that most companies pull, is to pay more. But as you try to compete in this marketplace, we really have to think about what is beyond pay that we're offering our employees. So it's that really good focus around culture. Is it meaningful work that fits the passion of this new younger generation of employees coming into the workforce? Can we align value systems to be able to attract, not just based on salary, but based on kind of that higher value of work that is going to align with your passions and your interests, and where do you want to put your life's work? And so along with that, we got to be thinking about career progression. Me spending time in this role, can I actually move up? Can I get the skill development and maybe some of these differentiated opportunities that I couldn't get somewhere else, along with those, really strong incentive pay? So it's really changing the underlying structure of how companies need to focus on their architecture, how they need to start defining things, how they're going to have to more rapidly update their jobs faster than what they've previously had to do. And, to all of Joanna's points, having that deep focus around this pay equity audit and how are we staying ahead of that so that we don't get ourselves in trouble.
That's great. Thank you, Mark. And that brings us to our first poll question. So poll question number 1. What is the biggest factor driving pay inequity? We'll give the audience about 30 seconds to answer. Managers, recruiters, catch-all job codes, market pressures. Okay, about 15 more seconds. Okay, it looks like the poll results are coming in. Okay, great. Let's close the poll. All right, pay equity, gets created in a lot of different ways, and it's a moving target, because managers and recruiters are deciding on hiring salaries every day. People are being promoted, job codes are being created, and the market pressures, like you talked about, Mark, we're dealing with at this time. That can lead to new employees making more money than installed employees doing similar work. So Mark, you and I have talked a lot about pay inequity and how it gets created. Although there can be that isolated pocket of bias or a problem with a particular manager, most of the time it's pay inequity isn't intentionally created. So Mark, can you talk about what you've seen when it comes to the internal challenges that organizations run into when they have to create, for example, new job titles in their HRIS system, and how that can create pay inequity in your experience?
Yeah, and as you know, we work with hundreds of customers all across different industries. We've done lots of consulting, and from my previous work, we've seen this as one of the biggest problems around, having job titles that can't keep up with your growth, can't keep up with the labor market. And it's a cumbersome way to update all of the systems, on the back end. And so what a lot of companies end up doing is you do have these catch-all job titles that say, oh, that's close enough to this role. One of my favorites was we worked with a company and they had, 2,000 business analysts across the org, and they had hundreds of thousands of employees. And so it was a fairly large percentage, and saying, business analysts in every part, from marketing to operations to finance, what are these business analysts actually doing? And we had to do some deep analysis, because there was no differentiation other than sitting in, what function they were in or what department they were sitting in. And so what we found out is anytime there was an analysis job that popped up, that was the kind of the catch-all to say, well, this is going to be easy to put them into because it fits close enough. Well, where that pay inequity happens is you're going to have differentiated employees in all of those areas, and different managers and different departments will have different philosophies on how they bonus and how they promote. And so you end up just getting this huge pay discrepancy across all these jobs, but they're not even alike. They're all doing something similar. And the organization just doesn't have the bandwidth or the resources to actually go in and split out those jobs, put them in the right meaningful role, create the right roles that actually fit the job, and do the proper, coding in the systems for pay ranges and for, the different tax structures and where it's going to sit. And so that's just a real common occurrence. We've seen it in dozens of companies, and it is a real problem. On the opposite side, we have, small organizations actually having very detailed job titles. And so you end up with, having 2,000 employees and you have 2,000 job titles. And so the opposite problem is you really can't compare people because they all have different job titles. How do we actually put them into logical groups? So again, it goes back to my comment of, like, as we start to look at, skill sets, that's a good way to look at these jobs and saying, are these roles actually similar? Should we be putting some of these job titles together? Should we be splitting some of these apart? And skills is a great lens to do that. And as you think about, really key growing skills, that's one of the popular, coding languages we hear pop up all the time is the coding language of Python, and how much that's grown over the year, just as a popular, premium that companies are looking for, because it's driving a lot of analysis work. It's driving a lot of coding work, especially, looking at large data sets and different things like that. Well, if you're lumping all of your best Python coders into a business analyst job, you're not going to differentiate between these high in demand, kind of future ready skills. How do we make sure that we identify those folks, get them into the right jobs, and actually, provide that premium that's needed for those hard to fill skills and hard to fill kind of, job architecture. So that's just one area of where, it's not always this super intentional thing that happens where companies are trying to create that pay inequity. It's out of complexity of the organization, and how fast things are growing is where the problem starts to fester. And it takes a lot of bandwidth and a lot of resources to start to unpack and actually, get the jobs architecture in a proper structure, so that you can start to look at that, especially from a leveling standpoint, from a from a differentiation standpoint on are these roles actually different from a skill perspective. So as we look at defining roles from that skills lens, it really will smooth out some of the architecture problems. It should help with some of the pay inequity conversations, and hopefully some of those audits, that you can start to get to that granular lens of where we need to do that analysis. And one of the nice ways is you can get started with us with a lot of those skills projects without blowing up your current job architecture and trying to start from scratch, because that of course doesn't help you manage the operating day-to-day of keeping your business going as you need to be focused on that work. So again, it's offering another lens to decrease some of that pressure and be prepared for the future.
That's super interesting, Mark. Yeah, and I know Lightcast has billions of data points that point to job skills, workforce talent, and labor market dynamics. And you can really see in Lightcast data all of what's happening with today's workforce, like your Python example. And that data is really powerful. With data, there really is no guessing. It's clear what's going on. And we all know what gets measured gets managed. So let's talk about that concept for a second. What gets measured gets managed. when it comes to pay equity. Joanna, historically, how has pay equity been addressed by employers, and what's a better model in order to address what we've talked about so far? How can employers avoid pay equity creep, be able to claim that they have achieved pay equity confidently, and how will this help them win the war for talent?
Historically, as I'd mentioned earlier, employers have really addressed pay equity sort of in a reactionary way, somewhat sporadically, and the better ones, might have done it maybe once a year or less, like on a, once a year process, or even less than that. And as I mentioned, often in defense to a pay discrimination lawsuits, there's this concept that pay equity audits have been very expensive, and they're often driven by counsel and very labor intensive consultants, including like PhD statisticians, and of course lots of spreadsheets and a lot of work. And so it's kind of been something that I think employers have really been hesitant to do, and no one had really thought about how pay equity could be managed as something as a function in HR, or just a business function within an organization that's managed on an ongoing basis, tracked, sort of created a baseline and done ongoing monitoring. And it's really just like, oh, we have a problem, we need to deal with it. It's really been kind of like that, as opposed to something that needs to be sort of handled on a regular basis. So what we are very excited about is, with our pay parity solution, Trusaic partnered with Lightcast to help employers choose fair pay at the time of hire that doesn't actually sort of exacerbate pay inequity, and that ensures market competitiveness. And that's one piece of Trusaic's solution. Like what Trusaic has done is we've sort of distilled down all the pay equity science into software that really puts the employer in the driver's seat. It allows the employer to basically not only conduct a pay equity audit, underprivileged, but to also monitor it on an ongoing basis from that point forward to see, is it getting better? Is it getting worse? Is it staying the same? So by sort of taking all of that analytics and marry that into incredibly accurate market comp data, like the data that Lightcast has, what you are actually providing is, you're giving recruiters and HR managers with pay guidance, so that, if there are any pay disparities, one, they know that they exist, and also to sort of control whatever pay disparities that do exist, so that it doesn't become unmanageable. So this is really in dramatic contrast to the old days, when you're kind of dealing with pay inequity after the fact, under crisis. You're aware of what's happening, and you're managing it. As Matt had said, what gets measured gets managed. That's really sort of the key.
Joanna, that's really helpful. Can we pull up the next slide? Can you explain how Trusaic's equal pay estimator works using a real example?
Sure. So, as you see on the slide, there's really kind of a snapshot from our pay parity solution. Overall, what this pay parity solution with equal pay estimator does is it analyzes employee details against internal ranges within the company, as well as this incredibly accurate labor market data that Lightcast provides. And so it gives you the ability to extend fair and competitive offers to new hires, prevents inequity from entering the workforce, reduces reduces risk by providing you with sort of ongoing real-time results using refreshed data, your own internal pay data. And really, you can use this to elevate your brand with external and internal pay benchmarking. Our solution can be provided in the sort of same day setup and implementation. So let me go over this example. So you've got the software engineer manager in San Francisco. That's your example. What our solution can provide you with is, you can see it's a little bit hard to read, but you'll see at the very bottom, what you're looking at is internal pre-approved pay range. So this is actually what your organization has as the approved range for a position. And in this case, the example is software engineer. Right above it is this external estimated range. So this is from real data analyzed to say, well, this is actually what you see out there in the marketplace, this range. So that's so you have those two data points. And then you have the data point above it, this is actually what your current employees are getting paid. And you'll see perhaps there's some outliers, and that would cue you into doing some further investigation as to why do you have that one person so below the range. And then, the most important part is sort of distilling the pay equity analytics. You get the pay equity range. So as you can see, it's a much narrower band than what the external estimated range provides, and indeed what your own internal approved range provides. The idea is you want to make an offer in that range. And if you do that, you are basically getting what range is permissible to really maintain pay equity and or not make the pay inequity worse. And this is for base compensation. We can also, this is also available for total compensation, and that would include things like bonuses and the like. And this is, this solution allows you to consider other factors. In this case, it's just looking at experience, but there are additional factors you can add that is a statistically sound framework where you can actually run this analysis. So this is very much sort of tailored to your particular new hire situation. This really allows you to take your pay equity audit and dovetail that with sort of going forward. What are you offering new employees? It gives you the opportunity, the ability to offer the right range. You run this pay equity audit, but you want to make sure that you're not adding to the problem by not paying attention to what that audit is telling you to do. And with the equal pay estimator, you have the ability to do that. I want to add one other aspect. What this system really allows you to do is it really tells you where you stand at any moment of time. Workforces are very fluid. So if you run a pay equity audit one day, your workforce is probably very different 6 months later. People get hired, people get fired, people get raises, et cetera. And that's all the data that goes into how you got to your pay equity audit and where your numbers actually stand. So it is a little bit of a moving target. So making sure you're doing an ongoing, sort of monitoring that on an ongoing basis is really important. And with respect to pay data reporting, which is in California and in Illinois, this also, this allows you to see what data, you're submitting this raw pay data. This will give you the ability to see, what is your actual pay equity, pay inequity, as opposed to sort of the sort of overall pay gap, which doesn't take into any consideration these factors like that you'll see here that you can consider in terms of what is a legitimate pay equity range.
Oh, great. Thanks, Joanna. And that brings us to our second poll question. Let's ask today's attendees poll question number 2. How do you control and monitor pay equity? We'll give the audience about 30 seconds to answer. So not actively monitoring and controlling, conduct a pay equity audit every 1 to 2 years, ongoing monitoring, controlling hiring salaries. Give the audience about 15 more seconds. Okay, looks like the poll results are coming in. Okay, great. Based on everything we know, and we study pay equity every day at Trusaic, I feel pretty justified saying if you're not actively monitoring pay equity, you really should be. Ongoing monitoring of pay equity and controlling hiring salaries using technology like the equal pay estimator is a much better approach than letting pay inequity grow and only conducting a pay equity audit every 1 to 2 years. Joanna, let's shift gears and talk about pay equity lawsuits. They really are growing in numbers, and the settlement amounts are often staggeringly high. Riot Games recently settled with California Department of Fair Employment and Housing. Do you want to share what you know about this particular case, how the expense of pay equity software is minimal in comparison, and how pay equity software could help counsel, or can help counsel reduce risk for their organizations?
Absolutely. So Riot Games, that settlement is certainly an example of what happens when you fail to take pay equity seriously. This was this led to an enforcement action by the DFEH. The resulting settlement included, among other things, they had to pay $100 million to their female employees and plaintiffs' lawyers. They created a $6 million fund for each of 3 years to fund this diversity, equity, inclusion plan and make pay adjustments, and also to hire a DFEH approved consultant to assist with their pay equity analysis. This is really a situation that no employer wants to be in, not to mention, just the bad press and pressure. The consultant that's going to assist you is going to put pressure on you in terms of the way the pay equity analysis is done. So when you look at that as sort of what happens when you fail, you really want to look at that and, consider in comparison what the real return on investment is by leveraging solutions that really can avoid this situation. You can do a return on investment or ROI analysis by basically comparing the risks, the cost of the risk from failure to act versus the cost to implement a robust solution. So that's really what you're looking at. So, for example, when you're looking at trying to do this ROI analysis, the sort of risk cost that you're going to look at from not doing what you should be doing is, attorney's fees and litigation. And everybody knows those aren't cheap. Obviously, the compensation component, that could be huge. Also, all the internal resources your company has to, put in to address that litigation risk. Also, there's, a little bit harder to put a dollar figure, but no less an actual dollar cost is, brand erosion, employee turnover, reduced productivity, basically, being subject to this kind of lawsuit is terrible for you as a brand. It's terrible for you, what you're saying to your employees. And so there are other costs too. So those are the costs on the one hand. Then you look at the benefits or the costs of doing this ROI analysis in terms of doing pay equity analytics and auditing. So, from a DI standpoint, you're looking at, the cost or, the gain, the dollar gain you get from your brand and reputation improvement, talent acquisition, employee engagement, and retention. So you look at that plus the cost of pay equity, the actual pay equity audit, which is actually not particularly expensive, especially if you use a solution like Trusaic's PayParity. So you run the numbers and you'll see that it makes sense to do it. So when you're looking at conducting this pay equity analytic under direction of counsel, you also can maintain attorney-client privilege. As an organization, your data is always potentially subject to subpoena, or if you're in litigation, you are subject to having it produced. Your raw pay data, your personnel data, assuming it's relevant to the pay discrimination lawsuit, it's all subject to discovery. And DFEH or other agencies, as well as litigation, they can subpoena you for those records. Now, if you are running a pay equity audit under attorney guidance, you may be able to protect yourself from that kind of mandatory disclosure. So that's why you want to make sure that you include your counsel in this process. And frankly, running this kind of pay equity audit with counsel, it really actually improves the process for the attorney from a risk perspective, and then it makes it easier for them to work with their internal counterparts within the organization to manage pay equity on an ongoing basis.
Thanks, Joanna. It's great to get both the legal point of view as well as the data and analytics point of view, which you're able to bridge both. Thanks again. Mark, back to you. Joanna talked a lot about pay equity audits and how ongoing pay equity monitoring solutions can help keep pay equity under control, and how they take into account skills as a legitimate business reason for differences in pay that can be substantiated and used as a defense if an organization is ever challenged in that regard. Mark, is there anything you want to share from your background and experience on the outside looking in when it comes to compensation analyses, and how you think this new way of looking at pay equity from a skills-based perspective can help organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. And as Joanna was saying, yeah, this staying ahead of this and continually monitoring to make sure that, that we're avoiding a lot of legal issues and a lot of brand issues and just bad publicity. From an internal standpoint, as companies are dealing with this, in a tight labor market that we're dealing with, it's hard to get candidates in. Retention becomes such a critical component. And as you saw from kind of the pay equity calculator that you showed, I mean, having employees in such a wide range, every new employee that comes externally into the org, does eventually create some resentment or some slighted feelings with the current employees that are in those jobs. And as we start to look at the differentiation between, why was this person hired externally and why would our pay start to get off, that job architecture matters, the skills that are, each individual is bringing to the role really matters. And so one of the things that will be important is to obviously do the job architecture work to keep that updated, to make sure that you're differentiating your roles in appropriate ways so that you don't create, this really bad tension between incumbent employees and some of the newly hired folks that are outside. But as you continually monitor that pay, you can start to bring up those internal employees where they do have the skill sets that are, needed for the future. We can bring those up to the right pay, equitable ranges. And, that gives a lift for, retaining folks. And keeping them in your org and having them thrive, and also just telling good stories, telling good stories of what are the expectations for the future of your workforce, where are you going strategically as a business, so that you can say we need to create a culture where you are internally focused around skill development so that you can maintain what's relevant for your role and future roles, so that we can continue to obviously, if you're providing value, the company should be providing that value back through bonuses and different incentive structures to keep you around, but it keeps those pay ranges more in line as you stay focused around auditing each of those roles and what is the differentiation from a skill perspective, to bring those roles into parity. So that storytelling component will be really important, especially for incumbent employees, of saying, hey, we had to go and hire, this, going back to the Python example, we had to hire, a Python expert because nobody internally, as we, talked to the different teams, as we did the different skills, that wasn't here. And so we had to go out and pay a premium. So you're going to see some discrepancy based on those hard to find skills and those in-demand skills that we're going to need for the future of our work. And that, all of those stories help, bring those employees up to understanding, as well as the encouragement to keep improving those skills. So as orgs think about turnover and diversity, predictive analytics will be really, really critical to work into your people analytics suite of data and the compensation analytics that come forward, because we have to stay ahead of this so that we can avoid that litigation and different bad press that could come along with with a huge lawsuit. So as a company is improving on their pay equity, the people analytics and different compensation analytics teams need to keep pace and continually be pushing those stats forward. One of the things that's also just really interesting to think about as we look, to the future, and some companies this is actually happening now, is thinking about a work without jobs or work without job titles. And you'll hear a lot of different, HR kind of forward-thinking future of work, estimators of what's going to happen in the future with work. And we've already seen some really cool examples of this, where a job title, could be going away in the future. And really what makes up a job is the set of skills needed to accomplish different projects, different, valued work within an organization. And as an employee comes into there, you will be hired exclusively from your skill set, and you'll be kind of this floating resource based on where are the most critical projects and work to need to be done within an organization, and you won't have the typical hierarchy structure that we see today. There's some great examples of a couple of forward-thinking firms that are already looking into this. Obviously, you need robust systems to be able to manage, who has all these skills, where do they sit, how do we convert our work from actual roles into a kind of a project-based workforce, and how do we have this fungible workforce concept. It's a little bit of a stretch, but there's enough examples that we've seen with our current customers that I really think that this is going to be the trend going forward. And as we've seen with the pandemic, with all vast layoffs and having to shift work quickly, this new model really does make sense to be able to reduce layoffs, if you can't find people for that, how do we shift those skills to the right work that's going to be relevant for how we need to pivot in times of, crazy, upset things like a pandemic? How do we retain those employees and actually get the value of that work? And we don't have to have it be tied to a specific department or a specific role anymore, but we can do this. That empowers employees in an immense way as we think about that new model. If comp is based off the skills that you have and the projects you get assigned to and the value that you're creating, it creates a unique opportunity for you to stay relevant in that job. And you no longer have to rely on the right place, right time for that promotion, or that person leaving the org. So now you step into that role. A lot of this kind of promotions and things happen. It's not always because you're the best person, but it's also just, matter of circumstance of what the current structure was. And, were you, have the right smile on your face to get that role over. As we move to more of a skills-based approach, you really do have to prove that value, but it also has the encouragement of that skill development and keeping your highest earning potential by staying relevant towards the work, but also being fungible to be assigned to the work that matters most to the organization. So the future of work is going to get disrupted on a lot of the pay fronts, but I think the employees are going to win, the candidates are going to win as there's more transparency. And as we think about our current problems of where there is a tight labor market, a lot of our research, if you've seen our report on the demographic drought, we aren't producing enough workers to actually, recreate, this population to actually backfill the amount of demand that we have in our roles across the economy. And so this problem won't be going away. It'll actually get exacerbated. So companies are going to have to get really creative of how do they think about work? How do they think about their pay? How do they think about the incentive structures that they're putting in place? Because this labor market crisis is really going to be an interesting thing to see play out, especially as companies continue to grow and that demand for work is still going to be there. We're going to have this discrepancy. And so companies will just have to get very creative on a number of fronts, and pay equity is one way that you can be leading the charge there, and focusing on your skills and how do we transition for that future of work reality is another good way to look at that.
That's super interesting, Mark. And a lot of the things that you shared, I've been reading, lucky enough to have an advanced copy of Josh Berson's irresistible book, The 7 Secrets of the World's Most Enduring Employee-Focused Organizations. And some of the things you call out there, I think he kind of alludes to happening in the future. So as we look to this future world where, well, there might not be any job titles, just skills, how can organizations prepare and get a jump start? And what would be the benefits of, say, starting now versus waiting to see if it actually will happen?
Yeah, starting the work now, I mean, you're going to get lots of immediate benefits outside of, just kind of the long-term benefits of, where you might have to scramble to get to the more risky standpoints of what you have to face in the future. But where companies get started, I mean, one of the best things that we coach and educate on with our customers is starting to put that skills lens on your role architecture and your job architecture. One of the best ways to do that is to take a look at all of your jobs and say, what skills are relevant for this? And of course, we're a little biased. We have a wonderful open sourced skill library, and it's all tied to our amazing labor market information. And so if you're going to go through this, you want a common skill language. You want to be able to start assigning this to your roles and getting really granular. And it's just a new way of looking at a job description directly from a skills lens. So no longer, job paragraphs and the description paragraphs that describe a role are really hard to update, really cumbersome. And so we're coaching corporations to say, hey, let's add something to your job architecture. You have the job description already. Let's put a skills lens on this. Let's put the most, common skills that you would expect to have in this job. Let's add that to, the other, job architecture metadata that's attached, whether it's a job family or a job function. This is just a new element that should be a standard part of your core systems and right on the job tables with all of your other good data that you're tracking. That'll weave right into your analytics that you need to do on those jobs. And it will allow you to have that new skill lens on the work and what is needed to actually do that job. As we look at, the employees that sit within those jobs, if clearly all of our employees have to go through some screening process, through interview process. We can rightfully assume that they will have most of those skills that you're defining that role. And so it also gives you a lens that you can infer those skills on the employee base, so that reduces the pressure of going out and trying to, do skill inventories for your entire workforce, which is a really hard exercise to do. But it will give you that new lens to look at turnover by skill. What are the most in-demand skills that we need to be thinking about? How do we create those future roles and think about, what skills would be important? And it allows us to start shifting roles in terms of the role structure and what skills are needed where, but it also helps us with shifting talent early to the right spots where we do need, a differentiated skill set, and how do we look at that skill development? So you get these added benefits of the faster that you start to get a skills lens on your world of work and the world of your talent within your organization, you're going to be making lots of really unique strategic decisions that you wouldn't be able to before, when you're just still working with vague job titles and vague job descriptions to try to make those decisions. Companies have been doing that for years, and it's a very manual process. It's a very subjective process. And so getting your data structured in a skills lens will be really, really relevant for not only pay equity, but also learning and development, talent acquisition. When do we buy talent versus when do we build talent internally? Those sorts of questions are critical to have that structure in place.
That's great, Mark. Okay, well, that brings us to our third and final poll question 3. Would you like to receive a personalized demo of PayParity and the Equal Pay Estimator? And while the audience is answering, let me just say thank you very much to our speakers, Joanna and Mark. It's been my pleasure to speak with you today on this topic. Thanks so much for all the wonderful insights and guidance. We have time left, so we still have about 9 minutes. So I do know that we did have at least one question come in from the audience. Let me check, probably more. Yeah, I think this one's probably for you, Mark, and it goes back to kind of skills and job titles. The question is, would you say the old practice of if a job is a 70% match, then it's the same job, is outdated, or is that problematic?
It is problematic. Yeah, I think that old practice of, kind of just assuming that a job is close enough, it just won't cut it, especially as you start to get into, all of the wonderful subjects that Joanna was mentioning around the audits and how you're going to be held to a higher standard for how do you look at your jobs and how do we start to look at, the folks sitting in those jobs and are they the same job across different organizations, across departments? And so I think we'll have to get much more granular, much more sophisticated with how we, start to look at our jobs across our org, and we can't just assume that, a 70% match is good enough.
No, I wanted to just add on that. I think, what I really kind of saw coming out of some of Mark's comments is, like in the legal framework, it used to be, it does talk about sort of equal pay in the context of skills, seniority, et cetera. And so implicit was this understanding that pay goes with skills. Pay does not go with job titles. Having said that, historically, a job position kind of came with an attendant list of skills. And as our society gets faster, evolves, that just no longer is true. So that's part of the problem. And, sort of making sure you do that proper job architecture has become increasingly important, but also because, people in a sort of typical employment situation, you get a title and your sort of task list, if you will, isn't going to be the same today as it will be 6 months from now, as it's from a year, but your job title may stay, until you hit sort of the next level, if you will. So that's part of the struggle. A lot of employers were like, well, it was fine before. Well, it's no longer fine. And that kind of complacency is just, there's no room for it anymore.
Yeah, that's great. And then I'll just share one thing I hear from our clients a lot of times is they think they can't look at pay equity, and because their job architecture has some of the challenges that we talked about in today's webinar. The reality is you can look at pay equity and job architecture simultaneously, and they can inform each other. So it's just one thing I wanted to point out is that you don't have to have the perfect job architecture up front in order to look at pay equity. You can look at pay equity, do your audit, do it in a statistically rigorous way using solutions like PayParity, and will actually inform what your job architecture should look like. And it does take into consideration legitimate business reasons for differences in pay, including things like skills, like we talked about today. Got another question here. I think it's related to, we talked a little bit about this pending legislation in California, SB 1162, which would make median pay data public. The question, Joanna, probably this is best for you. What does public mean exactly, and what organizations would be subject to SB 1162?
Okay, so, public means that the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, or DFEH, they're the ones that are going to be posting this data. And they're going to be posting this data for each employer, each employer that submits a report. It's going to start off with the larger groups, and over time, the smaller employer size groups will be, under that umbrella of employer data that the DFEH is going to publicly disclose. So, right now it's pending legislation. So we'll see if there's DFEH regulations down the pike, assuming this gets passed in this form, where it'll sort of provide more granularity, exactly what does it mean, where are they going to post it, et cetera. So those details are not available just yet. So currently the first employer size, the first reporting will be in 2025. Now, well, who are the employers that are going to be subject to it? So SB 973, which was really like a precursor to 1162, and what 1162 would be doing is really amending that and adding to it, is it applies to employers with at least 100 employees. What 1162 does is it's going to still apply to employers with 100 or more employees, but it also adds a separate reporting requirement to the extent that the employers have what's called laborer contractors or contract laborers. And really what it's really intended to capture are leased employees, things like that, where it's not your sort of traditional employee model, but the legislators recognize that some employers have other alternative workforce arrangements. So what they're intending to do is cover it all. That you can't like slip out by using laborers, if you will, like independent contractors, for example. So it's 100 or more employees, 100 or more contract laborers. Those are the ones that are subject to it. And what the DFEH would do is it would be posting pay data reports. And that pay data report would basically be for each job category, the numbers of people in a given race, ethnicity, gender, whether it's male, female, non-binary, and additionally just what the total wages are, the median wages, and the median hourly rates. So it's a lot of information. It's more than what 11973 currently requires, and this is right now making its way through the legislature.
Great, thanks, Joanna. We probably have time for one more question. So I think this one's for you, Mark. Mark, the question is, there's different compensation benchmarking data sets out there. What are the pros and cons of each one? Maybe don't get into all of them, but maybe talk a little bit about what separates the different compensation benchmarking data sets.
Yeah, historically, most corporations use survey-based systems, and so they'll work with different consulting firms or different compensation surveys. Really great data. It provides some of the granularity, even though some of the granularity gets washed out between the different parameters that the survey would do, and the surveys are usually done annually, and so it's also not a very fast-moving data set. The other spot that we can look is to the government data, which is a wonderful data set because it's comprehensively gathered. All tax reporting and tax filing entities, nonprofit, for-profit, have to go through that process, but a lot of that gets watered down because it gets categorized into occupation codes, which includes a lot of job titles all into one occupation code. So really great for comparison, but not really great for what should I actually pay somebody in this market for this job. It doesn't have the job title granularity that survey data does. As we move to more of these regulations requiring companies to post publicly, that's a wonderful spot for companies to use as a benchmark data spot, is what are the compensation ranges posted on job postings publicly. It's going to give us a much broader, more up to date, still has that granularity of showing job titles, and not only job titles, but skills. And so we can start to see skill differences between jobs and what are the advertised wages. And so that's just a really unique data set that's going to continue to improve as more companies are required to post their posting details for a particular job. It's going to be kind of a nightly updating pay benchmark, which will be really interesting for companies to start using, along with all of their internal analyses, of course. And so this is where I love, solutions like yours, where we can start to bring all this data together in one view with the internal, with some of those benchmarks that we can provide, really good insights, and you can start to, keep a pulse on continually monitoring all of those roles and making sure that we're staying on par, not only for, retaining our employees, but also offering, the right, salaries to keep that pay equity in line with all of our current workforce in the new workforce that we're hiring in.
All right, thanks, Joanna and Mark. I think we're completely out of time now. So thank you so much. This was Welcome to Workers' Skills and Pay Equity, How Compensation Conversations Are Changing. Thank you for attending. You may disconnect.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.